Welcome to the Bogosity podcast for the 28th of January 2013, the podcast that's riding into town on a pogo stick. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's excommunicate the news of the bogus. In an all-too-rare victory for privacy advocates, the TSA has begun removing its naked image body scanners from airports nationwide after the maker of the machines, OSI Systems Incorporated, couldn't make them less revealing. This ends a $5 million contract the TSA has had with OSI after Administrator John Pistoli concluded they weren't going to meet a congressional deadline to make the images less invasive. There are still some 174 of these machines in airports around the country, and OSI will bear the cost of removal. All of this comes after Electronic Privacy Information Center, or EPIC, brought a lawsuit in July 2010 claiming the scanners were the equivalent of a strip search. The D.C. Circuit Court ruled that the TSA had violated the Administrative Procedures Act by making the scanners a primary screening method unilaterally, without the required notice and comment rulemaking procedure. The TSA refused to comply, so EPIC and other groups filed an amicus brief which led to the court giving the TSA a rulemaking timetable to be completed by the end of February 2013. So now, they're being taken down entirely. It's good that the machines are going down, but we still have to put up with things like invasive pat-downs and other violations of our liberties at airports. The courts haven't exactly done their job at supporting our constitutional rights, but still, maybe this is the start of a trend. Here's hoping. Aside from airports, it seems that schools are another place where our civil liberties, not to mention basic common sense, have taken a pounding. Case in point, a 5-year-old Pennsylvania girl who was suspended from kindergarten because she threatened to shoot another kid with a toy gun that blows soap bubbles. Mount Carmel Area School District officials say that the remark makes her, get this, a terrorist threat. Yeah, because bubble guns are totally the terrorist's first choice of weapons. Not to mention all the Nerf guns and ammunitions easily available in toy stores. I hear some of them are stockpiling water balloons. They interrogated the kindergartner the next day for 30 minutes with no parent or guardian present. They then suspended her for 10 days. The lawyer retained by the girl's family asked the principal to cease since and expunge her record, which didn't happen, but he did get the suspension down to 2 days and the girl merely a threat to harm another student instead of a terrorist threat. I know, isolated incident, right? Well, get this. A Philadelphia girl was suspended because she had a paper gun, and the paper gun was simply a square piece of paper with one quarter turned off. No, really, the link's in the show notes and the picture's in the link. Go see for yourself. It's just a torn piece of paper. And what was she going to do with this so-called gun? By every account, she was going to throw it in the trash. But one of her classmates told an administrator that it was a gun, and the next thing the girl knew, she was being yelled at and told she couldn't bring guns to school. She tried to tell him it was just paper, but this fell on deaf ears. Then, unbelievably, school staff searched her for weapons while other students watched. The students then started taunting her, calling her a murderer. According to the girl's mother, Diana Kelly, her daughter wakes up at night screaming, having nightmares because of this incident. Quote, "Why did they threaten my daughter? Why did he stand over my daughter and tell her that he should call the cops on her? Why did he try to scare her?" You know, it seems to me that if we want to deal with the problem of bullying at school, we have to start with the administrators. Like the ones who suspended a girl for saying she was going to shoot another girl with her Hello Kitty gun. Or the 6-year-old suspended for pointing his finger at another student and saying pow. Or the case this podcast covered back in September, when a deaf toddler wasn't allowed to give his name in sign language because it resembles a gun. Morons, when they use the term handgun, that's not what they're talking about. I mean, really, how ridiculous can this possibly get? What epidemic of insanity has taken hold of school officials all over the country? When a piece of paper with a corner turned off is a gun? When something that blows soap bubbles is a terrorist threat? When they make a big deal about little kids pointing fingers? What even goes through the minds of these administrators? No, scratch that. I'm sure I don't want to know. But I do know that these people should never, ever, ever be put in charge of children. In my opinion, they shouldn't even be put in charge of tiny bits of string. You know, in all these stories, all these cases, it'd be nice if once, just once, the overbearing, bullying administrator was punished as a result, or better still, lost his job and wasn't allowed to work in schools anymore. But once again, we see that when it's government agents involved, actually holding them accountable for their actions and the very real harm they cause is more rare than the most precious gemstone. While the whole WikiLeaks Julian Assange business was going on, the man whose actions prompted it all, Private Bradley Manning, has been cooling his heels in military detention for almost 3 years waiting for his trial. Whatever hopes he had to have his voice heard and get a fair hearing have been severely reduced by the brazen, unconscionable, and unconstitutional actions of the judge in the case, Colonel Denise Lind. It's bad enough that Lind has excused them keeping him in the brig such a long time. She agreed with the prosecutor's contention that they needed this time to be able to get all the evidence together. Hey, Lind, the time for them to have gotten their evidence together would have been before they arrested him in the first place. You'd think that as a judge you'd know that. Or were you sick the day they taught that in law school? 3 years is ridiculous. As the common law concept going back centuries goes, justice delayed is justice denied. But it's just gotten a lot worse. Lind has now ruled that neither Manning nor his lawyers can refer to his motive at the trial. Yes, his motive has just been ruled inadmissible. Manning cannot tell the jury the reason why he leaked the documents or what he hoped to achieve by doing so. Here's another bit of law that Lind apparently slept through. Every criminal act has 2 elements to it, actus reus and mens rea. Actus reus, Latin for a guilty act, is the performing of the alleged criminal act, in this case, leaking the documents. But it's also important to have mens rea, Latin for a guilty mind. With mens rea, the defendant is demonstrated to have the motive and intent to commit harm by his commission of the act. Not letting the defendant give his true motive seriously undermines his ability to defend himself, and specifically in this case, defense attorney David Coombs' strategy of using a whistleblower defense. The judge allowed the motive to be brought up in only 2 contexts. 1, to show that he didn't know his leaks would end up in the hands of Al-Qaeda, and 2, to express his judgment that leaking the documents would cause no harm to the United States or be used against it by a foreign agency. Folks, that is just not good enough. The motive and the act itself are supposed to be viewed in totality, whether or not the benefits outweigh the potential harm. A whistleblower defense is a form of necessity defense. In a necessity defense, the defendant claims that the commission of a criminal act was necessary to prevent a greater amount of harm. A woman who is drunk can drive to evade a rapist, since rape is a greater crime than drunk driving. If the amount of harm Manning was trying to prevent by releasing the document outweighs the potential dangers, he absolutely should be allowed to argue that in court, but that has just been completely and totally denied to him. So once again, justice is denied for Bradley Manning. His lawyer is going to have a much more difficult time defending the case when he isn't allowed to speak to one of the major elements of the crime except in certain limited contexts. He's been completely denied his right to a necessity defense. These are not just legal technicalities. They go to the heart of our common law system of justice. To not be able to demand proof of the prosecution's allegations or to present evidence for the defense makes this little more than a kangaroo court. And if this is how the U.S. justice system is going to treat those involved, then Julian Assange had better stay right where he is. What else can you do when the very system set up to ensure justice works to prevent it? In another blow to justice and common sense, a U.S. Court of Appeals has ruled that marijuana will continue to be a Schedule I drug, despite our government's own studies showing that there is absolutely no justification for this. Schedule I means that the drug is highly dangerous, with no accepted medical uses. The first claim is laughable since marijuana cannot be attributed to even a single human death at any time in history. But this ruling had to do with the second part, that it has no accepted medical uses. That immediately raises the question, accepted by whom? And the answer is, of course, the FDA. Despite numerous studies in other countries showing marijuana's medical benefits, the mere fact that it hasn't been through FDA testing means that our government won't recognize the benefits. But the federal agencies that allow testing of marijuana only allow it to be tested for its potential harms, not its potential benefits. This is a classic catch-22. In Joseph Heller's eponymous book, Catch-22 means that you can stop flying bombing missions if you're insane, but if you want to stop flying bombing missions, you're not insane. So to take marijuana off Schedule 1, it needs to be tested by the FDA, but the federal government prevents that very testing. Oh, but if you want to study the medical effects of LSD or heroin, there are all sorts of options open for those. The court said that the plaintiffs, quote, are left with the difficult task of showing that the DEA has misapplied its own regulations. Well, geez, if they're just going to determine whether or not people are following their own regulations, then what's the point in even having courts to begin with? To support their case, the plaintiffs submitted to the court over 200 peer-reviewed studies showing marijuana's efficacy for various medical uses. The court completely dismissed every single one of them. Quote, petitioners construe adequate and well-controlled studies to mean peer-reviewed published studies suggesting marijuana's medical efficacy. The DEA, in contrast, interprets that factor to require something more scientifically rigorous. Now wait just a doggone minute. What is more rigorous than a scientific peer-reviewed study? The whole point of peer review is to help ensure that the research is of sufficient rigor. Granted, it's not perfect, but how else are you going to judge the rigor of a study? Quote, contrary to what petitioners suggest, something more than peer-reviewed studies is required to satisfy DEA's standard, and for good reason. The court then quoted, scientists understand that peer review per se provides only a minimal assurance of quality, and that the public conception of peer review as a stamp of authentication is far from the truth. Here, the court is deliberately quote-mining a paper published in the journal Nature, Quality and Value, the True Purpose of Peer Review. The point of this paper is not suggesting a replacement for peer review, but enhancements and other ways to make peer review better, in particular quantitative indicators measuring the rigor of a study. The court took a paper suggesting how peer review can be made better and made it out to say that peer review was no good. But in terms of scientific validity, peer review rules the roost. In fact, there's only one sort of study that's considered better than peer review, a meta-analysis of several peer-reviewed studies. Gee, it's too bad none of those have been done for medical marijuana. Oh, wait a minute, there are several of them! Like the 2007 meta-analysis published in Current Medical Research and Opinion, which concluded, quote, cannabinoids, including the cannabidiol THC buccal spray, are effective in treating neuropathic pain in MS. Or the 2008 edition of the European Journal of Cancer Care, which found, quote, the superiority of the antiemetic efficacy of cannabinoids was demonstrated through meta-analysis. Yeah, but I'm sure the word of a bunch of bureaucrats is much more reliable. The court concluded, quote, we are obliged to defer to the agency's interpretation of adequate and well-controlled studies. Judged against the DEA standard, we find nothing in the record that could move us to conclude that the agency failed to prove by substantial evidence that such studies confirming marijuana's medical efficacy do not exist. Right, because you allowed them to define the studies confirming marijuana's medical efficacy out of existence. There are numerous studies confirming it in all sorts of respected medical journals around the world. There are meta-analyses that confirm it. There are numerous medical organizations arguing for the medicinal use of cannabinoids. There just is no basis whatsoever for the claim that there are no medicinal uses for marijuana. When you have the courts resorting to creationist-level tactics, trying to impugn the research on medical cannabis like creationists try to impugn the research on evolution, you have to wonder what it'll take for us to get any real change for the better. And now it's time to disarm this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And this week it goes to Salon.com's political reporter Alex Seitz-Wald, who is tired of hearing Second Amendment advocates talk about Hitler. He published an article entitled "The Hitler Gun Control Lie," saying that it's the gun control nuts who somehow have their history right, and the rest of us just don't know what really happened. Quote, "The notion that Hitler confiscated everyone's guns is mostly bogus, and the ancillary claim that Jews could have stopped the Holocaust with more guns doesn't make any sense at all if you think about it for more than a minute." Well, it's a total straw man. No one is saying Hitler confiscated everyone's guns, but okay, Seitz-Wald, what's your evidence? Quote, "The Weimar Republic, the German government that immediately preceded Hitler's, actually had tougher gun laws than the Nazi regime." He went on to provide details, but it doesn't really matter. This isn't about what some other government did, even if it's the government immediately preceding it. This is about what the Nazis did. Right off the bat, he's committing a tu quoque fallacy. He quotes Chicago law professor Bernard Harcourt for support. "The 1938 revisions completely deregulated the acquisition and transfer of rifles and shotguns, as well as ammunitions," Harcourt wrote. Meanwhile, many more categories of people, including Nazi Party members, were exempted from gun ownership regulations altogether, while the legal age of purchase was lowered from 20 to 18, and permit lengths were extended from 1 year to 3 years. Wait a minute. If Nazi Party members were exempt from regulations, then how on earth was it completely deregulated? Completely deregulated means you get rid of all regulations and there are none left, including legal ages and permit lengths. This claim isn't even self-consistent. Then, right when he completely acknowledges the point gun rights advocates make that the Nazis disarmed the Jews, he follows it up with one of the biggest fails ever. Quote, "The law did prohibit Jews and other persecuted classes from owning guns, but this should not be an indictment of gun control in general. Does the fact that Nazis forced Jews into horrendous ghettos indict urban planning? Should we eliminate all police officers because the Nazis used police officers to oppress and kill the Jews? What about public works? Hitler loved public works projects. Of course not." Oh my God. Here he acknowledges the oppression of Jews, but says it just doesn't count for some reason. Blatant racism that he doesn't even try to hide. Here's another rewording of his argument. Does the fact that some people beat their slaves indict the institution of slavery? Well, yeah, it kind of does. Not only that, but he directly avoids the point. They took guns away from people they wanted to persecute. Nothing Seitz-Wald has said speaks to this point. It's also completely self-defeating. Again, the exact same kind of argument. Does the fact that some people use their guns violently justify taking guns from everyone? Even if we accept his line of argument, begging the question though it does, it still completely demolishes the very gun control measures he's trying to defend. His only real argument that gun control didn't hurt the Jews was that it wouldn't have worked anyway. Quote, "Omer Bartov, a historian at Brown University who studies the Third Reich, notes that the Jews probably wouldn't have had much success fighting back. Just imagine the Jews of Germany exercising the right to bear arms and fighting the SA, SS, and the Wehrmacht. The Russian Red Army lost 7 million men fighting the Wehrmacht, despite its tanks and planes and artillery. The Jews with pistols and shotguns would have done better?" There are 2 points to make here. First, there is all the difference in the world between fighting an opposing military and going from home to home trying to get individual Jews, especially with a lot of people hiding them out, as is what absolutely happened. Imagine the Nazis filing one by one through the front door to try and kill 100 Jews all armed. The second point is Hitler's very actions. Before invading Poland, the Nazis went in secret in the dead of the night to assassinate political enemies. But they weren't the only ones. Poland had a national gun registration list, and this allowed the Nazis to take out them as well, as a prelude to invasion. The Nazis knew full well that invasion and oppression do not work on an armed populace. That's why they only let Nazis own guns. Okay, Hitler didn't disarm everyone. He didn't disarm the Nazis. And gun control doesn't disarm anyone either. It doesn't disarm the police and the military. It also doesn't disarm criminals who just get their guns on the black market. What kind of point is this? I mean, come on. Very few people at the time thought the American colonists stood a chance against the Redcoats. The British Army was 5 times greater than the entire population of the colonies. And the Redcoats were winning battle after battle after battle. But unlike a war on an unarmed population, where you just have to take out the armed forces and you're done, in a country where the people are armed, they make you pay for every inch of ground you take. And as the U.S. Army found out in Iraq, they make an occupation all the more difficult. So you'll pardon me if I don't think it's our side that's ignorant of history here. He ends with a quote from Bartov. Their assertion that they need these guns to protect themselves from the government, as supposedly the Jews would have done against the Hitler regime, means not only that they are innocent of any knowledge and understanding of the past, but also that they are consciously or not imbued with the type of fascist or Bolshevik thinking that they can turn against a democratically elected government, indeed turn their guns on it, just because they don't like its policies, its ideology, or the color, race, and religion of its leaders. Really? You're going there? Come on, this is yet more... No, you're only going against Obama because he's black! Yeah, because no one ever stood up against any previous gun control attempts. Give me a break. And what is this about people not being able to turn against their government? Funny, here I was thinking that that's how this country got started to begin with. Seems to me it's Alex Seitz-Wald and the ones he's quoted who are either ignorant of history or lying outright. Either way, it's more than enough to get them all named this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And now for a special treat, 2013's first winner of the Silver Cluon Award. Laci Green has been running the weekly show Sex Positive for a while now, giving information about human sexuality from a rational scientific standpoint, debunking myths, and giving the straight facts in a way that's entertaining and accessible to everyone. Recently, she made a show about the abstinence-only sex education policies the governments here and there around the country have been passing, tearing it apart to show why it's bogus.
There is a little teeny tiny problem with abstinence-only education. Little teeny tiny issue of being entirely removed from reality. Fun fact, your grandparents, when they were teenagers, they were doing it. Your great-great-grandparents, doing it. Your great-great-great-great, okay, you get the point. And teenagers today, I'm gonna let you in on a little secret, they're still having sex. The kids who are taking the abstinence oaths, they're the most likely to get pregnant or an infection. So why is it then that 27 states in the US have abstinence-based education programs? Why is it that only 12 states require medically accurate sex ed? Why is it that only 8 states require that the information be unbiased? Seriously, my brain. They talk about birth control. They exaggerate the rates of failure and say that it's not a reliable way to prevent pregnancy. Liar! This isn't education, this is anti-sex propaganda that your taxes you're about to pay in the next few months pay for. And the best part about it is that it doesn't curb STIs or pregnancy, it doesn't stop people from having sex.
But as good as her takedown was, up to her usual high standards, it still doesn't quite rise to the level of direct simplicity that a smackdown needs to make in order to take the silver Cluon. Also, these same points have been made by others, and it's actually not that hard to debunk abstinence-only policies, so why does this video earn her the silver Cluon? It all happened in the first 30 seconds.
The neighborhood kids just love to go down by the river, and we're always telling them there are too many risks. Drowning, catching a cold. As a mother, I'm concerned. We decided to hide the life vests. We did not want to send the message that it was okay to be going in the first place. And we keep telling them, don't you dare do it. There's a shark. Would you believe that some of the parents at the school want to have swimming lessons during the school day? It's as if they want to see their kids drown.
Wow, what an excellent way to expose the absurdity of this stupid policy, thoroughly and completely. The rest of the video wasn't even needed at that point. The facts and arguments were just icing on a very rich cake. Well done, Laci Green. Keep up the good work with Sex Positive, and enjoy your shiny new silver Cluon. What you do with it is entirely up to you, as long as it's with consenting adults, of course. And now it's time to shake our heads slowly at this week's
Idiot Extraordinaire!
And for at least the second time, it's gone to someone I otherwise respect, but with one ill-conceived move, takes that respect down a notch. Stefan Molyneux is the host of Free Domain Radio, where he talks regularly about such subjects as anarcho-capitalism, Austrian economics, atheism, and political issues from a libertarian or anarcho-capitalist perspective. He does this full-time, so he depends largely on the monetization of his content, as well as sales of his several books. So it's understandable that he relies a lot on listener donations. But he himself completely undermined this with the following Facebook post, quote, "You received a donation of $2 Canadian from ... I don't mean to sound ungrateful, but... frowny face." Wow. You're making a big deal over a $2 donation because it's apparently not enough for you? Well, lots of people commented on this post, over 680 as of this podcast, some supporting him and some criticizing him. But there are really only two comments that are relevant here. The first is from the donor himself. Quote, "So, I'm a single father on a budget, have my soon-to-be 6-year-old about 60% of the time, and don't have a lot of disposable income. I caught a video on YouTube, found it informative, visited the website, read the spiel about donations, and I figured I can give a couple of bucks. Figured I'd do that continually as I'm able. And this is what I see afterwards when I get back onto Facebook. I'm very, very disappointed. Anyway, I shouldn't have to explain myself to anyone who hasn't taken the time to even consider what my situation might be. And those future donations, don't count on seeing any more from me." Hey Steph, word of advice. If you're going to depend largely on donations, how about not complaining about and denigrating the people who donate, especially people of limited means who give what they can in this economy? The other relevant comment is by Steph, many comments later, explaining himself. Quote, I know. It really does sound ungrateful, I get that. But I did want to express some frustration. Because of course PayPal takes out almost 20% of the $2, and then I end up having to track and record and summarize and report and pay taxes on $1.60, which I'm pretty sure ends up costing me money. I really do appreciate everyone's feedback, and I get that the comment came across as a little precious, but really, I am spending an enormous amount of money on this documentary, and I've never talked about small donation amounts over the past 6 years, even though it's happened more times than I care to remember. So it's difficult for Steph to process the donations and all the tax and accounting requirements for such a small amount. But Steph, you could have just said that originally. It's not the fact that it's difficult for you to process small donations, it's the fact that you didn't adequately explain yourself, and from reading the comments, it's clear you're losing a lot more donors than just this one. Here's what you could have said. I appreciate every donation, but you must understand there are difficulties in processing small donations. So as a favor to me, I would ask that, instead of giving me small donations over a period of time, please hold on to your money a little longer to give me a larger cumulative donation later. It really does help a lot with the costs. In fact, you might want to point this out on your donations page, which can be misleading since you recommend that people donate 50 cents for every podcast episode they listen to. The way you get donations is by respecting your listeners, not complaining because the amount they give is too small. I ask for donations at the end of every podcast. I am absolutely 100% grateful and thankful to anyone and everyone who donates, no matter how much or how little. I get quite a few small donations like this. And while it doesn't make me rich, it helps me break even with things like hosting costs and other costs of producing the podcast. I understand fully that none of you actually owe me anything, and even a tiny amount donated not only helps keep the website and podcast going, but it makes me feel really good knowing that there are people out there willing to part with even a small amount of their money in these tough times. With that said, it probably is worth mentioning that PayPal does take out a cut of donations, unless you donate with money in your PayPal account or your bank account, in which case the full amount goes in. But with debit and credit cards, a transaction fee is deducted. This fee varies based on country and the type of account. So whenever you donate, it's better to set up your own PayPal account and pay directly from there. That way the person or group you donate to gets the full amount, with no bank or anyone else taking their cut. But either way, there's a difference between politely informing people of this and grousing that a donation is too small. The former will let your donors know that you respect and appreciate them, and they'll help you out in return. But Steph did the latter, and a lot of people felt disrespected and disenfranchised to the point that they may never donate again. And when you depend so much on donations, that's the wrong move to make. Which is why it could only be Stefan Molyneux that gets named this week's
Idiot Extraordinaire!
Well, that wraps up this Gee, Your Hair Smells Terrific edition of the Bogosity podcast. Please visit the forums at Bogosity.tv where you can read the show notes and join the discussion on these and other subjects. This podcast is free but not free to produce, so please use the donate button at the top of the Bogosity.tv website or down the right-hand side of the podcast page and give generously to keep this podcast going. And if you'd like to contribute to the podcast, just send a question, statement, news article, or rant to podcast@Bogosity.tv. Put it in an audio file, and if it's good enough, it'll get played right in the podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from former Surgeon General Joycelyn Elders. I can assure you that vows of abstinence will break more easily than condoms. The Bogosity podcast is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 3.0 imported license. Bogosity. History is written by the winners, and so apparently is economics. That's why there's Liberty Classroom. Probably the best single learning resource for history and economics on the web, Liberty Classroom teaches U.S. history, Western Civ, and economics from actual university professors. There's lots of free material to get you started, including introductory lectures on all these subjects. And when you sign up, you'll get the full site's content for just $99 a year. You can watch or listen to the lectures whenever and wherever you want, even in your car. Learn at your own pace about the subjects you're interested in and become a more effective debater. You'll also get access to the professors via the discussion forum and even live video chats, all for the price of 2 cups of coffee a month. Use our special URL, libertyclassroom.bogosity.tv, and when you sign up, you'll be helping this podcast too. So bookmark libertyclassroom.bogosity.tv and use it when you sign up. Inform yourself against the myths and propaganda of our society. Visit libertyclassroom.bogosity.tv.